200 years ago, British engineers built a self-sustaining city underground. In September of 2024, this sealed place was found. We shouldn't have opened its doors. The city of Provecta was designed between the years of 1829 and 1856. Its engineers, sorcerers of their time, worked outside the parameters of the public sphere, partly to protect the nation's advanced inventions from foreign eyes, but also to evade the righteous fists of the church and the state, to evade any who might decry the futuristic research. The above world, still grappling with the wizardry of rudimentary electric lights, would have marvelled at Provecta's magic machines, water treatment systems, hydroponic farms, and, above all else, everlasting energy. A city below the soil, built to last, should the world above not last. After all, fears of war, famine, and society's collapse had started to spread across the globe. Provecta wasn't designed to be a safety net for mankind. It was designed for those wishing to escape from mankind. In 1857, a small total of 6,000 people disappeared into the ground, and the doors were closed for good. This classified information is known only by few of the few. Unlisted governmental arms, with records of things that are as good as naked to the public eye. I don't like him, Georgina Pendle whispered, voice half drowned by the crunches of many boots across the forest floor. Well, best not to let him know you feel that way, I told my fellow engineering consultant as I nervously eyed Dr. Thomas Gregson. Our research team approached the newly uncovered site, the city for which historians had spent decades tirelessly hunting, and I hardly believed any of the stories until I saw it for myself. Buried in the heart of a forest clearing were two steel doors, each several feet in depth, hidden beneath moss, dirt, and foliage shed from the surrounding oaks. The doors had been prized apart by a team that arrived before us, and this enraged Dr. Gregson, the leader of the expedition. "Why?" the man simply said, tone soft but firm. A man in a luminous jacket shrugged disinterestedly. Director Blom said that we had to... I was in the meeting with Director Blom, Gregson interrupted, voice a little louder. The doors were supposed to be opened under my supervision. It was all clearly specified. With all due respect, Gregson, the jacketed man started, hands on his hips. I don't work for your agency. Besides, you were late, and we were clearly contracted to start at noon. In fact, we started at 10 past noon. If we'd delayed things any longer, we would have faced repercussions, you know that. I wasn't going to lose this job. Pfft, Dr. Gregson scoffed. Think critically, Mr. Hanley. It wasn't my fault. There were issues with transport, and you were informed as such. You should have waited. Hanley, the jacketed man in his late 30s, simply shrugged a second time. He was the only member of the team who seemed unfazed by Dr. Gregson, the middle-aged scientist with narrow spectacles and a grey beard. Mr. Luminous Jacket and his squad of labourers didn't seem to understand the nature of the company for which Dr. Gregson worked, but I did. I knew to keep my mouth shut. Seemingly frustrated by Mr. Hanley's lack of response, Gregson barked, "You don't get it, do you? The site was disturbed an hour ago. Meanwhile, your lackeys were just sitting here, twiddling their thumbs. Exposure to the elements might have damaged artifacts inside. Might have... never mind." I frowned, doubtful that an hour of fresh air pouring through the open doors would have caused any problems whatsoever. In addition, I knew that Gregson knew that. which meant he was lying, meant that something else had disturbed him about Mr. Hanley's early start. Through the parted metal doors, framing either side of a 20-metre wide hole in the dirt, a staircase entered the blackness below. It disappeared into a void, even with our torch beams shining upon it. I was thankful that Hanley and his labourers led the descent, as something about those steel steps left my teeth chattering. We travelled 300 metres into the soil. Dozens of boot soles pounded against the stairs, sending metallic clanks ricocheting off the walls of that unthinkably large space. 2,000 steps, and they were remarkably intact. When the first of the labourers reached the floor at the bottom, their torchlights revealed a tunnel ahead. It was the width of the staircase and the length of our artificial beams. The edges of our lights scraped the end wall 50 metres away. Scraped, within that wall, a single wooden door of standard dimensions, possibly preserved, having seemingly been treated by some wonder layer. As we eagerly scurried towards it, arguments between team members fell by the wayside. Even the day labourers, who knew very little about the project, were ecstatic. The reality of the situation had hit. The city was real. And there, on a surprisingly small slab of stone fixed to the wall beside the door, read, Provecta. That was all. No slogan etched in Latin, no detail about whatever lay within. No warning. The door wasn't even locked, which left Dr. Gregson giddy and the rest of us unnerved. I told myself that the steel doors above had been the barriers, that I shouldn't have expected a slim wooden door to be secure in any way. However, when that oak wood swung outwards, creaking, the sound reverberated through both the tunnel behind us and the vast space beyond. That 1,000 acres of darkness known as the city of Provecta. As we spilled through the opening, our 24 torchlights cut through that black air, revealing a wasteland of buildings and a cobblestone street ahead, one shooting directly through the middle of the city. It bore a rusty signpost several yards from the entrance, which read, Main Street. On either side of this ancient road, there stood black husks of 2-storey homes. Hollow, burnt structures, stone-bricked ruins, with all wooden components lost to rot or flames. It all told part of a dreadful story from the past. But what sparked a round of gasps was that something shone in the distant darkness. Not the farthest extremities of our torch beams, but the distant lights of Provecta itself. Yellow specks were huddling together in the city centre. The inner city's sparsely lit island of life was surrounded by acres that formed the outer city's unlit corpse. Thomas, you were right. Life, Dr. Sally Ware, Gregson's colleague, whispered in awe. Let's not jump to conclusions. The lights have simply outlasted the city's residents, Georgina claimed, dashing the scientist's dream. The machinery was built to sustain itself, that's all, Dr. Ware. Whatever the case, technology remains the primary focus for this project, Dr. Gregson said. Mr. Broughton's source of infinite power, whatever it may be, does not deserve to die down here. It shouldn't ever have been hidden from the world above. Director Blom has ordered that we are under no circumstances to leave without it. Understand? 200-metre tall buildings stood at the centre of the city, towers of stacked windows, revealing floors still lit by a yellow artificial glow. Steel scrapers, given that their tops neared not sky, but the reinforced beams of Provecta's concrete ceiling, one of the largest concrete structures on Earth. Another astounding feat, that, given the time period of the city's construction, left me with a hot sting in my stomach. Nothing about that futuristic underworld sat well with me. We don't know for sure that the city is empty, I pointed out quietly. I was certain that not all sounds were coming from us, the 30 or so explorers clicking and clacking their feet against the road. Many of the noises sounded from somewhere deep within the city, and as much as I wanted to believe that the sounds were coming from buildings settling or old machinery chugging and churning away, I felt life in those occasional far-off noises. Dr. Gregson turned and shone his torch at me, while still pressing forwards. "Mr. Walter, keep your baseless thoughts to yourself. I hired you and Mrs. Pendle to consult me as engineers, not historians." I was thinking of an appropriate response when one labourer's torch caught a stone wall barricading the street ahead. A barricade which separated the dark outskirts of the city from the somewhat illuminated centre, the only remaining life in Provecta's skeleton. However, standing between us and the promised land was this 6 feet tall obstacle, topped with a wooden platform, and on a steel plaque affixed to the stone-bricked wall were the words, "No Men." One of the labourers was hoisted up by 2 others, and she found a ladder which she began to pull down from the wooden platform. The rest of us followed. A couple of minutes later, once we had all climbed across the wall, I saw the city centre more clearly. Main Street continued for another quarter mile before reaching a large T-junction, its far side lined with 4 large towers of various sizes. There shone patchy light from windows and lampposts ahead, though most of the city still remained in blackness. But it was something that indicated this, at one point, had been a city of the future, brimming with life, existing beneath a world that struggled to catch up. Then our rapid thoughts and steps were brought to a halt by Georgina's sudden scream. Torch beams shot towards her, acting as stage spotlights. They illuminated my colleague's weak, jittery forefinger as it jabbed towards a home's 2nd-floor window about 50 yards ahead. "What's wrong?" I asked, placing a tender hand on her shoulder. I felt Georgina's tensing muscles as she whimpered, "There was a woman." Dr. Gregson lifted an eyebrow. "I beg your pardon?" "In the window," my colleague explained as we all squinted at the glass pane in question. "I saw somebody watching us." "It's dark and the light is playing tricks on you," Gregson impatiently replied, before mumbling something about incompetency and continuing to walk. And there sounded further murmurs of uncertainty from other members of the team, but everyone followed the project leader nonetheless. We passed pristine 2-century-old buildings, some lit and others not, on our journey towards the tallest skyscraper at the end of the T-junction. I was so close to finding the words. The perfect combination of words to put my anxious co-worker at ease. But my tongue caught against my teeth as I reflexively bit down, drew blood, and winced in pain. I had seen a black shape flit across the road ahead. "What was that?" Dr. Ware cried, jumping backwards along with several of the labourers. "That wasn't a shadow," a worker yelled as he turned on his heel. Then that same man uttered a shrill screech. Most of us spun around to see what he'd seen, and we joined him in crying. Shapes were slowly moving from the stone wall towards us, blocking our exit. Figures in black robes of cotton, and below one of the shape's drooping hood, our torch beams revealed a lower face so nearly human, but horribly disfigured. It bore broad, flared nostrils and lips far too wide. There came no command from Gregson. Instead, chaos ruled as the members of our team dashed in all directions. Georgina Pendle and I followed Dr. Gregson's small collective forwards, given that there were no figures ahead of us, and as we darted up Main Street, beelining towards the Key Steel Scraper, there came screams from the fleeing colleagues behind us. There came screams from my own lips as I started to consider what fates might have befallen those poor souls. But I didn't turn around. I knew, when the screams began to die, giving way to crunches and splatters, that no escapees had succeeded. When the group of survivors finally reached the high-rise, 2 labourers burst through the entrance's empty frame, one that had clearly once housed wooden doors before rot took hold. The building's lobby was lit by oval-shaped bulbs hanging from the wooden ceiling above, and a stone sign clung to the wall ahead. It read, "Provecta's Institution of Research." Dr. Gregson didn't let us linger in the reception area. He seemed to know the building's layout, for he led us to a hallway on the right-hand side of the lobby, one that led into the heart of the research centre. I made the mistake of turning to look over my shoulder just before we disappeared into that corridor, and I stared out of the building's entrance. On the cobblestones of Main Street were flat, resting shapes, some twitching, others still, all painted red. Dr. Gregson took us through a side door in the hallway, and we began to climb a staircase. As we spiralled upwards, muffled thuds resonated from within the building. A telltale sign that we were not alone. "I'm going to make a call," Mr. Hanley said as we burst onto the 4th floor. "Here!" Dr. Gregson said triumphantly, charging through another empty doorway. "Dr. Gregson," I began, following the man as he scooped a remarkably well-preserved book off a dusty desk. "Why, this is only, at most, a couple of decades old," he whispered, stroking the leather cover of the book lovingly. "Do you understand? It was printed recently, Dr. Wade. They must have continually revisited and reprinted Mr. Broughton's original work. New historians, engineers, and scientists. That means those figures we saw on Main Street, they were people. They were actually in the one and—" "No signal," Mr. Hanley interrupted, wafting his satellite phone angrily as he appeared outside the doorway. "We're on our own, Gregson, and everyone knows it. People are getting scared. They're scattering. Is there another way out of here? Away from Main Street?" The expert ignored him, smiling as he flipped through the book's pages. "This is everything. Everything we need." Hanley, Georgina, and I gathered in the small room, a neglected wooden-walled office that hadn't been touched in years. We stood behind Dr. Gregson, the project leader who clutched that book tightly to his chest as he stared out of the window at the dark city beyond and its concrete sky overhead. Stared at the occasional shadows flitting across alleys in the distance. "So much life," Gregson whispered hungrily. "Listen," Hanley said, putting a hand on Gregson's shoulder. "We're not going down Main Street, okay? Show us how else to get out of here. Now." The doctor shrugged him off and turned around. "We must get this book out of here." "No, we must get out of here," Hanley qualified, but he grumbled and nodded as Gregson pushed past, leading the 4 of us out of the small office. Someone must have been on the verge of saying something. telling Dr. Gregson to get a hold of himself. But a slight creak brought all of our heads and torches spinning to the left. My thumping chest stilled when I saw only an empty hallway to the side, but then the rim of my torch beam bulged inwards, only ever so slightly. Something cut into my light from above. And when I fearfully lifted my torch upwards, the glow revealed twitching legs dangling from the ceiling. The blood-stained body of Dr. Wade was slipping through an open panel in the ceiling. But what made me scream until my lungs caved were those horrible green eyes surveying me from the dark hole above, watching me challengingly whilst it dragged the limp, bloody body out of sight.
Help! Help!
Dr. Wade gurgled through blood. What haunted me most about that creature was its slowness, for it had nothing to fear. No need to pull its prey quickly away, as it knew we would not be able to stop it. I whined in terror as Dr. Wade gasped pleas to the four of us, while she disappeared into the blackness. Then the green eyes vanished into the dark, and a wooden panel scraped across to fill the hole. "We need to leave now," Dr. Gregson finally but calmly admitted, before tossing the book to me. "That'll fit in your rucksack, won't it, Mr. Walter?" Georgina blubbered. "They're everywhere." Then, like a church mouse, Gregson began to run back towards the staircase, and the rest of us followed. Followed him down the stairs, then into the lobby. There, we found a haunting row of black hoods outside the building, obstructing our exit. Like that creature in the ceiling, they did not pursue, and this unsettled me greatly. Gregson then headed down the corridor to the back of the building, and we found ourselves following a twisting, turning route of alleyways. Gregson showed us the way to a door at the back of the building, and we found ourselves following a twisting, turning route of alleyways. A cobblestone ginnel maze that felt disturbingly small and misplaced in such a grand city centre. Of course, what truly made those winding alleyways feel disturbing was the quietness of the city. No more distant thuds and clangs. I didn't like that. I missed those sounds. I preferred knowing that the horrors were far away. We reached a scarcely lit side road away from Main Street, then bounded towards another segment of the stone wall. It seemed that the barrier continued through every adjacent street. It formed an unbroken circle around that illuminated heart of the city, separating Mr. Broughton's new society from the old and inferior world of men. Georgina gasped as we started to climb over the stone barrier. I heard it too, skittering from all around, from rooftops and alleys. Most unsettlingly, from the dark interiors of the charred buildings alongside that cobblestone street ahead. And when we dropped back down to the road, finding ourselves on the other side, the side of men, Dr. Thomas Gregson made the mistake of casting his torch up to the source of commotion, to the clattering roof tiles of a small house beside us. Atop those slats was a man. Well, a once man. I know no other way to describe it, even after seeing the thing in the harsh glare of our 3 torch beams. A man, dark hood over his back, with pale flesh coated in rucks, folds that made his skin look too loose for his frame. Yet, that frame was still unimaginably bulky. And the man had double the limbs, 4 arms, 4 legs. Before I processed the very nature of such a creature's existence, It scuttled across the tiles on all eights. Then the man hissed and jumped off the roof's edge, plummeting towards Dr. Gregson's frozen form. But Mr. Hanley threw himself in the way, pushing Gregson behind him, and caught the full brunt of the creature's attack. The lead labourer shrieked as the clawing began, as the once man tore into his victim's frail human body with 20 fingernails. Georgina and I, faces coated in tears and terror, wrenched our eyes away, turned to avoid the awfulness of seeing Mr. Hanley's fate. Mr. Hanley, a man whose first name I never even learned. He died in a place that doesn't officially exist, meaning he no longer exists either. My colleague and I eventually found the courage to flee rather than freeze, but Dr. Thomas Gregson did not follow. As Georgina and I darted down the side street, slipping through the blackness towards freedom, her torch clattered to the cobblestones, fell from her hand in our feverish escape, and I was left to light the way with the sole remaining torch between the pair of us. But mere moments later, those two sets of footsteps became one. I knew, at the time, that I should keep pressing forwards, but I wouldn't. And when I turned to see Georgina standing motionlessly in the darkness, I was initially relieved to find her there at all. To find her simply quivering on the spot. "Come on," I urged, spare hand outwards for her to take. But my friend eyed me absently and very slowly shook her head before releasing a violent splutter. Then came red droplets from both her twitching lips and the centre of her white shirt. "20 fingers sprouted from the darkness behind my dear friend and walked around the outer edges of her midsection. It was as if a crowd of people were clutching her body, but I knew that only one of those wretched things was behind her. One was enough. The many hands yanked Georgina Pendle back into the darkness, dragged her at unthinkable speed beyond the farthest reach of my torch beam, and then I was alone. There came more skitters, more shapes moving at the outer reaches of my torch's glow, a glow that seemed to be shrinking and filling with the black shadows of those things which moved towards me. They were encircling their final victim, the final human. I turned and continued at full pelt along the side street, knowing that I was only 100 yards from the front wall of Provecta. I tried not to focus on the horrors revealed by my torch's light. Not just the shadows of those pursuing creatures, but bloodstains, spelling the same two words of revulsion on cracked windows. Filthy sapiens. Then I made it to the far wall. I flew so eagerly into it that my face slammed into the concrete before my hands. Of course, I quickly shook off the pain, given the adrenaline, and I followed the wall towards Main Street. Only another 30 yards or so along, I found the door. And as I turned to shut it, I saw one of those terrible 8-limbed things. Saw it eyeing me with a hood over its face to cover all but a sly smile. It could have pursued me, could have burst through the wooden door even after I slowly shut it. I doubt that a lock would have stopped that thing. But it didn't follow. It eyed me with malevolence, with some hidden design imprisoned behind its eyes. When I made it back to the surface, I did not contact anyone. I ran, ignoring all calls from all organisations. I had to know Provecta's history before they took the book from me. Perhaps ignorance would have been better. I read that, in the mid-1900s, the city's cracks began to show. Cracks both figurative and literal. In 1941, a bomb struck the ground above the city, shaking the ceiling of Provecta and causing several buildings below ground to collapse. One building, the city's air treatment facility, was compromised. Even that underworld paradise did not escape the effects of the Second World War, and that only bolstered thinkers such as Dr. Isaac Grant, a scientist who, along with Provecta politicians who despised their ancestors in the world above, sought ways to distance the city's population from humanity, sought ways to turn mankind into something new. Dr. Grant wanted the inhabitants of Provecta to do more than simply adapt to the lessened air quality of their underground dwelling. He wanted to create a new race of people. And in the 1940s, the political conditions were, at long last, perfect. Fear ruled the minds of many Provecta citizens. Hundreds upon hundreds of people submitted to Dr. Grant's trials. They didn't want to be human anymore. They were genetically altered to survive on less food and oxygen, to see better in the dark, to be stronger and faster. The procedure resulted in mutations, but Grant explained that it was only to be expected. After all, they were no longer human. Then began the war between the genetically altered and the humans who were unwilling to evolve. No men were allowed beyond the stone barrier erected around the city centre. Viewed as genetically inferior, all Homo sapiens were driven into the outskirts and they were cut off from the core resources at the heart of the city. No power, no food, no water. Shortly after the segregation, there came violence, and not from old men, but from the new ones. Houses were burnt, blood was spilt. The superior abominations tore the inferior humans, limb from limb. I handed the book over to dozen miners, but even now, all of these months later, one of Dr. Isaac Grant's passages still stands out. We must realise the dream of our forefathers, and it is clear now that they wanted us to end what came before. End mankind.